Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Stanford. Congratulations on getting in. I actually was a graduate student at Stanford, but we never had anything like this when I was a student, so you guys have a big advantage on me. And I think I've been doing this program for a few years, and I think the great thing about it is it exposes you, obviously, to all the interesting stuff going on at Stanford, and you learn some of the details of what's going on. But equally, I think it just kind of gets you early on thinking about the big picture and where you might fit into the big picture. So hopefully what I'll do today is give you kind of a broad overview. Maybe you noticed that we went out of order, but this was intended to be like the broad overview in the sense of energy, food, and water connections, which a lot of us on campus are quite interested in, Craig being one of them from the engineering perspective. And again, it's not because necessarily you all want to work at the interface of one of these things, but oftentimes, understanding the connections to food or water will really have an impact on which energy systems we get most excited about, or vice versa. Let's see, what did I want to warn you guys of in advance? I'm not going to try to do anything exhaustive, right? I don't want to put you to sleep here. I'm going to try to kind of highlight a few things, give you a sense for the type of stuff that goes on here, but also kind of the bigger picture. So quick show of hands to get you guys warmed up. I mean, just as maybe a obvious point, but maybe you all haven't thought about this, is the reason we care about these connections is that it's not just energy that we need as a society, right? And it's not just food that we need, and it's not just water that we need. We need all of these things. If in sort of efforts to get energy, we really hamper our ability to get food and water, that could be a problem, right? And not only that, but all of these are increasing over time. So we need more energy, more food, more water, or at least we want more energy, more food, more water over time for various reasons. My question to you is, which of these three do you think is increasing the fastest? Which do you think is in a sense, the hardest to keep up with, or at least the fastest moving target? So show of hands on energy. How many of you think that energy is increasing the most quickly? Energy demand. How about water demand? Okay. And how about food demand? Okay. Kind of evenly split. And that's about right. So they're all going up. So you're right in that sense. But actually, it's I think the slight edge goes to energy. And part of the reason for that, I think, is also interesting from another perspective, which is that the reason, so this is a plot showing, based on a bunch of household expenditure surveys that have been done across the world, it shows you where people spend their marginal dollar. When they get an extra, if they get a raise at work, or if they find $10 on the street, on average, where are they spending that money? And this is ranging from the poorest countries in the world to the richest countries in the world. Not to say that every country falls exactly on this line, but this is basically a fit to the data. And you can see that in the poorest countries of the world, about half or more of your average dollar goes to food. This is the most basic necessity that people have. And it can often be much more if you're the poorest part of that country, say. If you're a very poor citizen, you might be spending almost all of that marginal dollar on food because you're so food deficient. And you can see energy is not explicitly broken out here, but you can see things like transport, things like other include a lot of energy, things like housing. You can see those are pretty significant, but certainly not as big as food as you get in the poorest countries. But as you move up the ladder of development, you still want food, but you can only eat so much, right? Your bellies can only get so big. In the richest parts of the world, you're in the richest part of the world, by the way, we only spend about 5 cents of a marginal dollar on food. On average, somebody in California, say, only spends, let's say, 10% of their overall income on food. But on the marginal dollar, only 5 to 6%. And this includes going to restaurants and everything. So the actual money we're paying for the food itself and not the services associated with it is really pennies on the dollar. But our appetite for energy keeps growing, right? There's no limit to how much energy we can consume, how many energy services that we consume. And this is overall the reason that at the global aggregate, we see food demand going up a lot. We see food demand roughly on the order of 50 to 70% over the next 40 years increasing. But energy demand is increasing faster because not only do we have energy demand increasing from the poor spending more on energy, but we have also the rich spending more on energy. Now, the other interesting aspect to this is as you recognize connections between the two, you can easily see that it's very possible if energy demand, say, affects the availability of food, that it could be that demand at the high end of the income spectrum is going to indirectly affect the food availability at the low income end of the spectrum. So there's lots of equality issues going on here as well. So this is just one example of kind of thinking about the differences and the similarities between food, energy, and water. But what I'll try to do in, let's say, 15, 20 minutes is give you a brief primer on these connections. Or is it primer? I never know how to pronounce that. You should never put a word in your talk you don't know how to pronounce. I think it depends on what country you're from. So we're talking about energy, food, water links, at least as we tend to think of them. I tend to work mostly on food things, so you'll probably see a little bit more emphasis on that. But I'm an avid consumer of the energy and water research that goes on campus and outside of campus. And then I'll just give a couple of examples of what that, how that plays out in terms of thinking about particular energy technologies and what that might mean. Okay, so here we have energy, food, and water. You could draw arrows between all of these. Obviously, we use a lot of water for food. I'm not going to talk about that because it's not really energy specific. Shouldn't surprise any of you that we use most of the water, fresh water in the world goes into producing food. The amount that we consume directly is a small fraction of that. We actually use more water in energy production than we do in terms of direct consumption, but the majority of it goes into food. I'll focus on the energy link. So energy effects on food systems. The main three that I think of, and there's kind of, again, this is not an exhaustive list, but the main three that I think of, and I'll go through in turn, is firstly the fact that we need energy to produce, to consume, to prepare, to process, cook, all these things. We need energy in our food system. And I'll explain exactly how that works and how much we use. The second is that because now we have lots of different technologies that can use land to produce energy, that there is a very, and sometimes direct or at least indirect competition between energy and food for land or resources that are produced from land, like, say, corn or sugarcane. And what that means is that markets for energy and food are very tightly connected in ways that they weren't always. So even things that aren't maybe obviously incorporating food into the energy production, for example, the big change in shale gas and the change in natural gas prices over the last few years, or the recent drop in oil prices. This can have major repercussions for food systems, not just because we use energy as an input to the food system, but because these markets are competing. And a lot of times it's the energy price that's propping up the price of things like corn. And that's kind of a new thing that developed over the 10 years. Probably in your lifetime it doesn't seem so new because it's half your life this has been the reality, and it's probably the half of your life you've been paying any attention to these things. But historically we've always thought of these things as being two separate markets, and they're no longer the case. That's no longer the case. And then finally, on the longer time scales, as you hopefully well know, we have this thing called climate change. And climate change is really driven historically by energy production and energy consumption. And we also know that climate change has a very direct effect on our ability to produce food. So these connections can play out on long time scales. In any one year, the amount of CO2 or greenhouse gases we put up is not going to have that much of an effect in itself, but the fact that it stays around, accumulates, changes the climate system, and agriculture depends a lot on the climate system. All right, so energy into food. Now this is something that I think a lot of people recognize, that we've gone from, say, very subsistence systems in the history of agriculture. They still exist in some parts of the world, but very low external energy inputs. So all the energy is basically human energy. And we've transitioned to, this is a picture of a rice field in California. So two different rice fields, a much more industrial, mechanized, kind of fossil fuel based, if you want, based system. And a lot of people recognize that the amount of external energy inputs have increased hugely, on the order of 30 or 40 or even more times than we used to have. And a lot of people see this as now we've turned the process of food production into one that just takes fossil energy and converts it into food energy. I think what that maybe fails to appreciate is how much increasing the amount of energy inputs increases the productivity of all other resources that are used in agriculture. In particular, the land productivity, so the amount of grain you produce on a unit of land is typically 5 to 10 times higher in these more energy-intensive systems. And the amount of labor that we use is on the order of 100 times smaller. Labor and land are the two most costly inputs in any farm budget. If you look at pretty much anywhere in the world and you look at the amount that farmers spend on different inputs, these are the two big ones. So the ability to displace a lot of those inputs with energy has been a huge boon to food production. It's been a huge reason that we have decreases in food prices in the long term. And on top of that, it's been a huge land saver. So one of the things that people don't often realize is that if we try to sustain the amount of food that we produce on a lower energy input system, we would need more land. If you look at all the carbon that would be associated with that additional amount of deforestation, I'll come back to this a bit later, but if you look at all the amount of greenhouse gases and carbon that would be emitted associated with that lower intensive system, it's actually much greater than the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted from the energy use. All this to say that energy is consumed in agricultural production, but there's lots of good reasons that it is, and it makes the system overall much more efficient in using other resources. If you look at the energy that goes in, it's actually partly for the types of tractors that I showed you, filling them up with diesel, partly for the drying of grain with often with methane, but by and large it's a function of the fertilizer production. So the Haber-Bosch process, which we use to produce synthetic fertilizer, very energy intensive, and all of that added together, all the fertilizer we use in the world is about half of the energy that we use in agriculture. We also use energy to move water around, so this is another link to the water system. And then a lot of chemicals that we produce, yes, they per pound use a lot of energy, but we don't use that many pounds of them, at least in the big picture. So all of this together is 10 exajoules of energy. So here I'm going to quiz your sort of your familiarity on day 2, or is this day 3? Day 2, with the energy system. You should kind of start to get a feel for these numbers. So what is the global energy system in exajoules? Anyone? How much is the global energy system overall? How much energy do we use as a global society? In exajoules, you can give it to me in any quads, whatever unit you prefer. All right, here's another form of that question. What fraction or what percentage of the total do you think 10 exajoules is? 10 to 20%. Over half. 60%. Like 5%. 8%. 8%. Very precise. We're going to go to decimals. All right, so is 10 exajoules a lot? As an absolute number, exa is a big number, right? You should look up your exponent. Exa is like 10 to the 15. A lot of joules. If you look at a massive earthquake, it's even bigger than that. But if you look at total global energy use, which is about 550 exajoules, we're talking on the order of 2% of total energy use to produce food in the world. So, considering how essential food is to society, we're actually using a very small fraction of energy for that. Now, this isn't the whole story, because this is just the amount we use to produce the food. Moving it around, processing it, cooking it, if we add that up, that's actually altogether more than 2%. So if you add everything together, it starts to approach the 10% that was the initial guess, in terms of what our food system overall uses. But in terms of production, we're at about 2%. Now, so that's to say it's an essential part of the food system, but it's also not, I would say the food system is not a major user of energy. The other main connection, though, between energy and food markets, as I mentioned before, is competition for resources. And this, historically at least, has been in the context of biofuels. So biofuels is just a word that means any liquid fuel made from biomass. And the idea of biofuels, at least if you're really trying to sell them hard, is that because it's vegetation growing up, sucking up carbon dioxide, then you convert it to fuels that you are then basically net neutral in terms of your greenhouse gases, because all you're doing is sucking up the CO2, releasing it, sucking it up, releasing it. Now, of course, there's energy in the system that is both growing the crops and processing them into ethanol, so it's not quite net energy neutral or net greenhouse gas neutral. But it's certainly more attractive from a greenhouse gas perspective than at least some of the worst fossil fuel technologies. There's a lot of interesting life cycle analysis done on how does it stack up to like the best fossil fuels versus the worst biofuels. And there's been a lot on that. But for your purposes, all you really need to understand is that biofuels are very common now. They're kind of fall into two camps. One is the sugar-based biofuels, which are ethanols, and the other are the kind of the oil-based biodiesels. And just like we have gasoline and diesel, we have ethanol and biodiesel. Very rapid increases. Sorry, it's a bit hard to see, but I was trying to find a graph that goes up more recently. So this is pretty recent, 2013. Back in 2000, so what were you guys? I sound like the old fogey up here, but you guys were still quite young in 2000. You guys weren't, quite paying attention yet. But we really didn't have anything such as biofuels. Biofuels really came on in the 21st century, and it's increased rapidly. And what this is showing is a breakdown of that. Basically now, it's largely, at least on the ethanol side, it's largely a story of corn ethanol in the U.S. and sugarcane ethanol in Brazil. That's way over half of overall biofuels in the world. Then you've got Europe, and Europe is basically biodiesels. This breaks it down by continent, showing you both the growth over time and then the composition. So you can see ethanol is dominating, the green bars dominate the North and South American contribution, and then biodiesel dominates the European and rest of the world, so like Asia. Thanks. That's to question period, right? Not 10 minutes total? Okay. So it's been a rapid increase in biofuels. It's associated with that, as I said, we've seen this rapid increase in the energy system's demand for food crops. And one way of seeing that is if you look at time series of the prices of, say, the commodities, crude oil in blue and corn in red, you can see that they bounced around largely independently. So, for example, when there was, a shock to the food system, say a bad harvest, it didn't really affect the energy system. But more importantly, when there was a shock to the energy system, it didn't really affect the food system. Now what you see since the increase in biofuels is, as far as correlations go, it's increased strongly. So when there was a big uptick in energy prices, food prices went up. When they both dropped, they both dropped. Now this is just correlation, right? This is not causation. It's not telling you what's driving the other. But if you look at the numbers in terms of the total capacity of these markets, it's pretty clear that it's not the food markets driving the energy markets, because ethanol overall is a pretty small fraction of global energy use. Largely, this is believed to be the energy demand as gasoline prices go up, as oil prices go up. Basically, the price at which ethanol becomes profitable goes up. That drives demand for corn grain into ethanol distilleries. That drives corn demand up. As corn prices go up, so wheat prices go up because they're substitutes in the feed system. Soybean prices go up. Rice prices go up. So a lot of things are connected through this demand for energy. Now, going forward, it's not so obvious how quickly this biofuel demand will go. And this is maybe kind of the broader point here, is that as you think about future energy transitions, they have huge implications for food systems. So whether we go down a path of flex fuel vehicles and increased biofuel production versus electric vehicles, whether we go down a biofuel system based on sort of crop-based biofuels or biomass-based biofuels makes a big difference. Now, one of the interesting historical footnotes is part of the reason that the ethanol industry became so big was that the corn prices were low. They were looking for a way to prop up farmers, partly because the old additives to gasoline were found to be problematic for various reasons. But the other thing is that it was viewed as propping up this industry was a good thing because it would transition us to this world where we were using all sorts of marginal biomass, not sort of prime grains and sugarcane for fuel. So this is kind of a complicated table, but the point here is that if you look at the original mandate that started actually mandating ethanol use in gasoline blends in the US, the idea was that by 2014, what would be happening is we'd have a rapid ramp up in terms of billions of gallons of cellulosic biofuels. So these are made from basically the stems and the scraps of plants you can think of. They could be grown from all sorts of marginal lands, it was thought. That was supposed to be ramping up. Also advanced biofuels, which are things like sugarcane ethanol, which is much more greenhouse gas beneficial things like sorghum-based ethanol were supposed to be ramping up. And the corn was basically supposed to be flatlining and even declining. But the reality has been that each year the EPA keeps revising their estimates because the technology just hasn't come along. And this is kind of an interesting history in how long do you prop up technologies. But the cellulosic industry has basically been only able to muster commercially viably zero as of 2012 or 2013. Now they're up to about 0.1 billion gallons compared to the 3 or 4 that they were supposed to be. And similarly, advanced biofuels has been much slower to come along. So initially, there was lots of ways this could play out to be good, but right now what's happened is that it's still a major demand on food grains. I won't take more time on that, but we can come back to it in questions. The third thing that I mentioned is climate change, and I won't kind of spend time convincing you that energy production has led to climate change. This is a summary showing you what that climate change implies for food systems. Just a summary of projections from the IPCC report where different studies are kind of tallied up, whether they show benefits or losses for crops and the severity of the benefits or the losses. So blue would be benefits, red would be losses. And you can see that over time it becomes increasingly a negative picture as temperatures keep increasing, as weather patterns change. Again, we can talk more about this, but the point is that there are these tight links on these long time scales associated with these energy transitions that we make. Now in terms of water, sorry, I'm not going to get to water yet. So this is the other arrow. Do food systems affect energy? And I would say not much. As I said before, the energy system is quite large relative to the food system in terms of dollars, in terms of total physical size, in terms of exajoules. So in the short term, the food system is really the tail on the dog. But in the long term, one of the interesting things relates to this deforestation link that I mentioned before. And one way you can think about climate change is that there's a total cumulative emissions that we're kind of allowed as a society to emit over time. And that's very closely linked to the amount of climate change that we get overall. So historically, we've emitted about 1,300 billion tons of CO2. These units probably don't make sense, but you should kind of start to get familiar with them. If you look at kind of the best estimates of what 2 degrees means, it means about, say, 2,500 to 3,000 gigatons of CO2 that we could emit over the lifetime of emissions. So a little bit less, or maybe say roughly double of what we've emitted historically. So we have this allotment in a sense of what we could still emit and stay below 2 degrees. A lot of that, though, has already been committed in the sense that the power plants have been built, the cars have been sold. We're not expecting super rapid transitions out of any of these very large systems. So you can think of committed as already having been emitted, just not having been emitted yet. And then this is all kind of what we have to play with in terms of new technologies, new policies. So not a whole lot. And where agriculture and food come in is that land use change historically has been a pretty sizable amount of our emissions. But it's actually been a pretty stable and even slightly declining one because of our success in producing food. Again, because of a lot of intensification of agriculture, we haven't needed that much more land. We've still had some deforestation, of course, but not as much as, say, when I was a kid. And if you look, obviously the fossil fuel emissions have continued to grow. But if you look going forward, if there's no kind of guarantee that this continues to be small or shrinks. If we struggle to meet our food needs and we start to increase the amount of agricultural land, then you're talking about on the order of 5, 10, maybe even more gigatons of CO2 emitted per year from land use change, which then reduces the allotment that we have, so to speak, for energy systems themselves. So on the longer timescales, there are constraints that our kind of success in the food system will place on energy. All right, last few minutes. Water use and energy. This is just an example from California. I don't want you to get lost in the details here. But one thing just to point out is that there's a big difference. If you hear people say that we use, I don't know, 80% of our water and energy versus 80% in agriculture, well, you say 80% doesn't add up. How could you use 80% twice? The answer is that there's a difference between sometimes people are talking about the amount of water that gets put into the system versus the amount of water that gets consumed in the system. So a lot of water in energy systems goes into the energy system but doesn't actually get consumed or in the sense evaporated. It doesn't get lost to the atmosphere. It just gets discharged. In California, it gets mainly discharged to the ocean, and a lot of inland places it'll get discharged back into rivers, whereas agriculture gets basically almost all consumed. So there is a lot of water needed for energy. It needs to be available. It needs to go into the system. It's often for cooling. or cleaning, as I'll talk about in a second, but it's not necessarily lost to the system. There's also big differences between different technologies. So if you look at, say, traditional gas or nuclear power energy systems, they tend to use a lot of water for cooling. Some of the newer systems are a little bit more water efficient. They're a little bit less energy efficient because they're dry cooled and not wet cooled. But then some of the renewable technologies are actually very attractive from a water perspective. Wind and solar in particular use very small amounts of water. So this is another case where, you know, thinking about the connections actually makes some of these systems look even more attractive. So let me just talk about then if you take specifics or specific cases and think through these connections. The idea here is that as we do this at Stanford and in a lot of different schools, if we think about energy transitions and what they mean, the idea is we don't want to be caught by surprise about something really bad that we didn't think about, right? That's the first order thing. The second order thing is if there's some real big benefit that we see in some other field, and Craig is really good at this. That was a really good example. He didn't even talk about his stuff on fish feed, but one of the things they're doing with wastewater now is producing potentially high-quality fish feed out of some of the nitrogen gas that's coming out of it. If you see those sort of opportunities, obviously those of you in the business school can imagine that that totally changes the economics of it. It also totally changes sort of the net societal impacts of a technology. So one of the big things to think about is, again, this really important need for energy in agriculture. And it's not a coincidence that if you look at, say, electricity around the world, that the darkest areas in the world also pop up as the most food insecure places in the world. And so if you think about energy technologies that are especially useful in kind of remote rural areas, these can be especially powerful from a food security perspective. So one of the projects we've worked on in our center is looking at using solar power in remote areas in West Africa to drive pumping of shallow groundwater. And that shallow groundwater that then gets used to increase dramatically the productivity of the system in these vegetable gardens. And there's all sorts of need for good business models to do that, but it seems to be quite a success, and it's, again, more evidence that energy is often the critical constraint in these systems. Another way this has influenced our thinking is thinking about how do we kind of rethink or design new systems that are coming online. And one of the things we did with a Tomcat proposal is look at the potential for coupling high capacity solar PV arrays with agricultural production. Because one of the interesting things is that the frequency and the amount of watering that you need for these panels to keep them clean and to keep them running at high efficiency is actually not that much lower than the amount of water you typically need for some of the hardy desert agricultural plants that are grown, especially things like agave or aloe. And so we've done a lot of kind of calculations looking at how this would work. There's also been, I guess the picture didn't show up. There's, this is actually an example, I think, of a trial going on in India. There's a lot of commercial interest in this coupled solar agricultural systems. Similarly, there's a lot of interest in coupled wind farms in agriculture. But that basically takes thinking from the outset about how can we make this system more beneficial from a food or a water perspective. It often makes good business sense, but it also, I think, increases the scalability if you think about resources as being a constraint on the scalability of systems. All right, so I'm going to open up for questions. They asked me to just mention what classes I teach this year, and these are them. So I teach a modeling class in our department in the fall. I teach more of an introductory level class that a lot of students from other departments take on feeding but 9 billion. And then we're starting a new class which is more for freshmen and sophomores, so probably not appropriate here, but more about why do we care about climate change and things like that. All right, thank you. Go ahead. Yeah. No, sorry, her, and then you. Yeah, good question. So I don't know if everyone can hear, but just asking about alternates to corn and sugarcane. There's been a lot of research on that. So the ones that were actually funded through a lot of work at Stanford and elsewhere, there's a big institute in Illinois and Berkeley, was focused on miscanthus, which is a very fast-growing grass. There's also a lot of work on switchgrass, which is more of a native to North America. These plants are very productive. Their thought was that they would actually maintain that productivity in more marginal areas, and that's still kind of open for question. But the big constraint on those has been that they don't produce any real starchy grain or sugary stock like sugar and corn does. So the energetics of converting that to then a liquid fuel has been harder. And there's been all sorts of research funded on kind of clever ways to convert these things to fuel more efficiently. And that, I would say, has made some progress, but it hasn't yet gotten to the point where it's commercially taking off. So it still has its enthusiasts. There are some remarkable plants out there. But I would say, over the last 10 years, it hasn't panned out as the enthusiasts kind of advertised. The other one that people got really excited about was jatropha, which does produce kind of an oily seed, and it's a very, let's say, it can survive in really marginal conditions. So people thought that this would be a great non-competitive source for food. The problem is, again, the energetics are tough, but also the economics are really tough. How do you get farmers to grow this thing? It's actually poisonous to humans, so you can't have the alternate use of food, which is nice. And it also, even though it survives in poor conditions, it's not that productive. So there's others. Agave and aloe, as I mentioned, they're quite productive. That's what we were looking at actually in the solar, co-located solar agave. The idea would be to grow the agave for liquid fuels, not for human use. All these things, I think, work out, but there's reasons that corn and sugarcane continue to be used because they're extremely productive plants. They're extremely efficiently converted now. That industry is very well developed, and so there's a lot of low cost options there that compete with the other technologies. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, so the question is about some of the stuff Michael Pollan has become popular for saying about the benefits of eating locally, eating organic, and the increase in health costs of eating unhealthily compared to the fact that we pay less for our food, but we pay more for it in health costs. As kind of an advertisement for the course Feeding 9 Billion, because what we do in that is tackle some of these kind of common conceptions. I think that if you think of it from an energy or just an efficiency standpoint, but particularly an energy standpoint, eating locally and eating organic don't make a whole lot of sense. I think there are other reasons you could come up with for eating locally or eating organic. But actually the energy cost of moving food around the world is really quite small. And it's really much smaller than the difference in efficiencies of growing food in different places, right? So locally, I can go to the local market and buy a locally grown apple. But that locally grown apple was probably in cold storage for 2 months because it was picked, a long time ago. Shipping it from Chile on a cargo ship is incredibly efficient. So that's one of the homework assignments in that class, is just understanding that there's really not an energy-based argument. On the organics, it comes down to this issue of efficiency of land and labor, and organics just haven't been efficient in either of those. So of course there are I think some aspects of organics that make a lot of sense, but if you think of it from the global perspective, if you're not using land efficiently, then your greenhouse gas savings are probably, I would say, misleading because you're potentially using more land. In terms of labor savings, it depends on how much you want to pay for food, how much you want to pay for labor, what people want to do with their lives. Mostly people don't want to work in agriculture. So I guess that gives you a sense of my feeling of those. But I think, the one thing to understand about industrial agriculture is it gets much more efficient over time. One of the things I didn't show you was that energy use in US agriculture has actually gone down over the last 40 years as our production has more than doubled. And a lot of the principles of organic agriculture, like integrated pest management, more efficient use of manures and everything, that gets integrated into industrial agriculture as well. But industrial agriculture is not kind of constrained by these like hard and fast rules of organics, like no GMOs and no synthetic fertilizers and things like that. Just, okay, 5 minutes. I'm going to go to people who haven't asked questions there, and there, and then there, and then we'll come down here and here. So the question, I think, is that is the kind of subsidization of corn unfairly hampering the development of other biofuels? Is that a fair paraphrasing? Okay, so certainly, agriculture is all mixed up in politics in any country that you go to. The U.S. is no exception to that. Corn is certainly historically been a real priority of the U.S. government. There's huge amounts of infrastructure that have developed around corn, so that really benefits any system that's going to try to tap into a corn. I mean, it's very easy to, say, find a supplier of corn grain. And as the ethanol got mandated, it did create a very real, cushion for these ethanol producers to go and invest in ethanol and not worry about the bottom falling out. But I would say equally there has, or I don't know about equally, but there's been a lot of push on trying to support these kind of second generation or third generation cellulosic type of technologies. And so I think it'd be hard to say that, that the main reason corn ethanol continues to be widely used is a policy, at least in the short term. It hasn't, I think, been a policy decision. It's, again, corn takes a lot of abuse and is probably a bit too subsidized relative to other crops, but the reality is it's an incredibly productive plant, and because we have such experience with it industrially, we're incredibly good at converting it to ethanol. So actually, you know, when oil prices go high, it's extremely cost competitive. At $40 or $50 a barrel, it's a different story. But you know, there's always a reason that things are doing well in the marketplace. Policies have something to do with it. There was some questions. Yeah.
I guess it's quite a bit to from a cost perspective. It seems to me that you have pricing tools to deal with kind of the energy system.
Yeah.
But the sensitivities around doing a similar thing with things like water or food are much more delicate. Moving forward, what kind of policy tools do you think should be adopted? How trying to regulate those systems more?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that, you know, if you take the case of water in California, certainly it's a sensitive topic, but I think over time the pricing mechanisms take hold and they do have effects, but it's just harder to get them going. On the food system, you know, there's obviously a lot of people who feel like you have a right to eat, but I think the way you do that most efficiently, and again, I'm talking about things I don't really know about, is that you have a strong social safety net that makes sure that people have the ability to afford food, not so much that you try to directly impose low prices or impose. One of the things, though, that people have advocated for, and I'm not saying that this is a good idea, is that you try to restrict where crops can be grown for energy production. So you say only on the marginal lands can we grow miscanthus, and I don't see any real way of making that work. I mean, maybe it's possible, but I think if miscanthus is a super productive crop and there's a way of getting it efficiently into fuel, then farmers are going to grow it where they can grow it the best, and that's going to still compete a lot for food production. So it's a very tricky balance. I think what the most effective way to me is to really be cautious about anything that's a liquid fuel-based transportation system. Yep, we have time for one, and then I promise these guys down here, so I'll answer really quickly. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Yeah, so questions about losing farmland. Locally, it can be really important. You know, as you get development around cities, often on really good farmland, you lose it. There's also a locally very significant issues with salinization or loss of soil quality. Totally happens. At the global scale, I would say that, you know, soil is certainly a very important resource that's not easily renewed. I think that though the majority of systems around the world are in decent shape, that's a short answer, but it's an important issue that we have to keep mind of. Okay, you guys go. Okay, so both questions related to that first graph I showed about the marginal dollar spent, and one of the questions was, would they be spending more on non-food items if there were more non-food services provided in the marketplace or goods provided in the marketplace? And how does that jive with the fact that actually the price of food is a lot more expensive here than it is in some of these countries? The basic answer to both of those is, well, on the one hand, just, you know, there's an old saying that a well-fed man has many needs and a hungry man has only one, right? So there's just in these systems, people are food insecure. They don't have enough food, and so if you get $1, you're not gonna spend it on any sort of transportation or shelter before you have food for your family. So I think that's not so much a latent demand issue. Our incomes are just much higher here. So in a relative sense, the amount of fraction of our income that we have to spend on food is much lower, even though in an absolute sense it might be higher.
Okay, we have to
Thank
cut
you.
it off there. Let's thank David again.